Hello, my dear friends. If you think orgasms are a private affair in the bedroom, you've never heard of Victorian medical therapy, a time when women weren't allowed to desire, but were prescribed to achieve orgasm by doctors. Strange machines, secret treatment cars, medical diaries full of desire buried in cold language. And then there were the servants, the spas, a whole society living in conflict between morality and instinct. Tonight, you'll enter the darkest chapter in medical history, where pleasure is covered by white coats. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us from around the world. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soothing background, and let's embark on this journey together tonight. If silence had a currency in Victorian society, women were forced to pay with it every single day. From the time a girl reached adolescence, she was instructed not only to behave with modesty, but also to erase any visible trace of curiosity about her own body. The unspoken rule was clear enough that it needed no constant repetition. Good women did not ask questions about desire, and good women did not name the parts of their bodies that might betray such impulses. To break that rule, even by accident, risked being marked as a woman of the weak morals, the sort whose name would be spoken in whispers rather than in praise. That suffocating atmosphere created a kind of cultural silence that grew heavier with each generation, until it became the defining expectation for women in Victorian homes. The purpose of marriage, as everyone was told, was reproduction, not intimacy. Sexual relations were discussed in terms of duty, family continuity, and religious obligation. Pleasure was never to be acknowledged, and the very idea that a woman might have desires of her own was dismissed as improper. For those who dared to complain of pain or of feelings they did not understand, the label of hysteria was waiting. The diagnosis offered doctors a way to avoid confronting what was really happening, and it offered families a way to preserve appearances. But for the women themselves, hysteria was not a label of care. It was a dismissal, a declaration that their voices could not be trusted. Magazines of the period echoed this attitude with endless lessons on restraint. Women were advised to spend their time in domestic duties, to guard their speech, and to avoid any signs of impropriety. Even reading certain books was discouraged, for fear that too much knowledge might awaken unhealthy curiosity. In sermons from the pulpit, priests spoke of temptation as a force that women must resist at all costs. And mothers passed down these warnings with soft but urgent words, reminding daughters that their entire reputation could collapse with a single misstep. It is almost laughable to think how seriously society treated silence as if it were the ultimate proof of purity. Meanwhile, men were granted freedoms without question. They were expected to explore taverns, brothels, and other hidden corners of the city as part of their natural growth. Nobody publicly condoned such behaviour, yet everyone accepted it as an ordinary stage of life. The contradiction was obvious, but the culture depended on not acknowledging it. Husbands might return home carrying the consequences of their adventures, yet their wives were the ones who bore the blame. To question this injustice was unthinkable, for even raising the topic of illness risked shattering the fragile image of purity that every respectable family wanted to maintain. In private households, silence became a form of armour. When illness arose, it was reshaped into something that preserved appearances. A woman with unexplained pain might be said to have nerves. A woman with a lingering fever might be said to be delicate. Medical notes avoided precise terms and instead cloaked symptoms in vague language. Gossip worked in the same way, twisting discomfort into moral suspicion. Rarely was a man's behaviour connected to a woman's suffering. In many ways, this is no different from modern scandals where public outrage still falls disproportionately on women, regardless of who is truly responsible. The result was a culture where women lived under constant fear. They feared not only the diseases that could harm their bodies, but also the accusations that could destroy their reputations. A minor infection could be transformed into evidence of sin. A persistent cough could trigger questions about hidden indiscretions. Doctors, unwilling to confront the reality of transmission through husbands, preferred to soothe patients with tonics rather than with explanations. Silence itself became part of the treatment, a shield that protected reputations while sacrificing health. Education for girls reinforced this same system. Lessons emphasized modesty, obedience, and domestic management. Instruction about the body was absent, replaced instead with moral rules. Medical guides written for women avoided anatomical detail and offered only moral direction. The message could not have been clearer. Ignorance was virtue, and virtue demanded ignorance. Reading this now, I cannot help but feel unsettled at how efficiently knowledge was denied to women as a way of keeping them controlled. This ignorance served multiple purposes. It kept women from questioning their conditions, from challenging authority, and from demanding accountability. If a woman insisted that her suffering was real, she risked being called unstable or unchaste. If she asked too many questions, she could find herself treated as a moral problem rather than a medical one. Families, desperate to protect reputations, encouraged silence at every turn. They preferred to cover windows, dismiss servants, or invent alternate explanations rather than admit the truth. On a wider scale, society projected the issue outward. Discussions of disease in newspapers or public lectures always emphasized the poor, immigrants, or prostitutes. Respectable homes were portrayed as free of such concerns. The illusion was maintained with care. Even though countless women suffered quietly behind closed doors, this illusion served the interests of men, clergy, and physicians alike. By maintaining silence, they preserved an image of order and moral superiority. The truth was simply too inconvenient to acknowledge. The consequences were devastating. Women who contracted venereal disease from their husbands faced both illness and shame. Society rarely acknowledged the connection between a husband's infidelity and a wife's suffering. Instead, suspicion turned inward, focusing on the woman's supposed failings. Death certificates obscured the reality, listing vague causes rather than the actual disease. Families buried not only the body but also the truth, maintaining the facade of purity to the very end. The irony of it all is difficult to miss. A society that prided itself on moral superiority was built on layers of silence and deception. In the parlours and drawing rooms, people spoke of virtue and discipline. In the bedrooms upstairs, women bore the silent weight of pain and shame. The obsession with purity did not protect them. It trapped them, isolated them, and exposed them to suffering without recourse. Victorian society's silence about women's sexuality and illness was not a matter of oversight. It was deliberate, designed to keep women obedient and reputations intact. The result was a culture where suffering was hidden, where knowledge was denied, and where silence itself became a form of oppression. This was the environment in which medical practices like treating hysteria would later thrive, offering women a strange and unexpected path toward experiences they were otherwise forbidden to name. Orgasm in Victorian medicine was stripped of its meaning as pleasure and rebranded as something far more clinical. Doctors did not speak of desire, nor did they use the language of intimacy. Instead, they described it in detached terms, calling it a nervous reaction or a biological discharge. This redefinition allowed society to accept what was happening without confronting the truth of female sexuality. Women were told they were undergoing a medical procedure, not experiencing something forbidden. The vocabulary of science acted as a shield, protecting reputations while denying the reality of the body. In practice, this meant that physicians could perform treatments without raising suspicion. By naming orgasm a therapeutic event, they legitimized an act that otherwise would have been scandalous. The woman on the examination table was not a participant in pleasure, but a patient undergoing a prescribed cure. The difference was not in her experience but in the way it was recorded. To preserve social order, every sensation had to be translated into cold, mechanical language. It is almost comical how a simple change of vocabulary transformed an intimate act into an acceptable medical duty. This framing created a peculiar paradox. A woman might leave the doctor's office having reached a state of relief that in any other setting would be judged immoral. Yet because it occurred in the context of medicine, she was considered restored to balance. The body's responses were not hers to own, but were explained as nervous symptoms beyond her control. In this way, the medical profession both concealed and exposed female sexuality. It concealed it under sterile terms, but it also exposed countless women to experiences that society otherwise denied them. The process itself was treated with professional seriousness. Doctors noted the length of time required to produce results, the visible signs of relief, and the recurrence of symptoms. They wrote of muscle contractions, nervous release, and temporary improvements in mood. The very words that should have acknowledged pleasure were rewritten into signs of disease management. To read these notes today is to see how language was used as a weapon, bending reality to fit cultural demands. One cannot help but notice how similar this is to certain modern workplaces, where human experiences are reduced to technical jargon to make them appear less threatening. For women, the experience could be both bewildering and liberating. They were not told that what they felt was pleasure. Instead, they were assured that it was a necessary treatment for hysteria, nerves, or other vague conditions. The safety of that medical label gave them access to sensations they could never have admitted wanting. Some women returned repeatedly, framing their visits as acts of health rather than indulgence. Whether or not they believed the explanation, they learned to accept it as the only way to experience their bodies without shame. Reading these accounts leaves me with a strange mix of sympathy and unease, knowing that what was denied in public became permitted in the name of a cure. The broader culture supported this arrangement because it kept everything in balance. Families could claim their daughters or wives were receiving proper care. Doctors could insist they were providing necessary treatment, and women could remain within the boundaries of social respectability, even as they encountered something entirely at odds with those rules. The contradiction was managed not by resolving it, but by disguising it. So long as nobody named orgasm for what it was, the illusion of propriety remained intact. What makes this episode in medical history so striking is the scale of its acceptance. Thousands of women were treated in this way, and yet the subject was shrouded in silence outside of medical literature. In polite conversation, no one would mention such things. In households, the visits were spoken of only as consultations for nerves or fatigue. The practice was both everywhere and invisible, a testament to how powerfully language can shape reality. The clinical framing also gave doctors a peculiar authority over female bodies. Because orgasm was described as a nervous release, only a physician could determine when it was necessary and how it should be achieved. Women were discouraged from seeking knowledge on their own. The treatment belonged to medicine, not to them. This dependency reinforced their position as passive patients rather than active participants in their health. It was another way in which control was maintained, cloaked in the neutrality of science. At the same time, this redefinition laid the groundwork for developments that would soon change both medicine and culture. The repetitive strain of performing these treatments eventually drove doctors to look for mechanical assistance. Devices would soon be invented, further reinforcing the idea that orgasm was not an act of pleasure, but a technical solution to a medical problem. The shift was subtle, but powerful. What should have been recognized as human intimacy became part of a clinical routine, hidden behind the veil of scientific progress. In the end, the transformation of orgasm into a medical event reveals more about Victorian society than it does about medicine itself. It shows the lengths to which a culture will go to preserve appearances. It demonstrates the power of language to control perception, and it highlights how women's bodies became the ground on which these contradictions were managed. They were allowed to feel, but only under another name and only within the walls of a doctor's office. Victorian doctors who treated hysteria assumed a role that blurred the line between medicine and intimacy. Their task was described in the most clinical terms, yet the reality of what they were doing cannot be overlooked. With their hands, they worked directly on the female body, seeking to produce what they called a release of blocked fluids or nervous energy. In their records, this was nothing more than a duty, a matter of medical necessity. But the women who underwent it experienced something that was at once therapeutic, bewildering, and unlike anything else allowed in their tightly controlled world. The practice turned doctors into reluctant intermediaries between cultural repression and physical relief. Sessions could be long and exhausting. Some women required hours before reaching the response the doctor considered necessary. Physicians described their own fatigue openly, complaining in private notes that the procedure was physically demanding. To them, this was not about arousal or intimacy, but about persistence until the prescribed outcome occurred. It is striking to imagine such scenes, where a physician worked tirelessly with a patient while both pretended that nothing beyond treatment was taking place. It almost sounds absurd that a doctor could complain of sore hands from work that society still insisted was not sexual at all. The setting for these treatments was rarely romanticized. They took place in clinics, in private offices, or sometimes in domestic rooms repurposed for the purpose. Curtains were drawn, voices hushed, and the work began. Doctors wore the same detached expressions they carried into other examinations, taking notes on timing and response as though they were monitoring a heartbeat. The coldness of this approach only added to the strange duality of the act. On one side, it was deeply personal, involving touch that would have been scandalous in any other context. On the other side, as it was stripped of warmth, presented as a procedure like any other, women submitted because they were told it was necessary. The diagnosis of hysteria hung over them, and treatment offered relief not only for their bodies but also for their reputations. By visiting the doctor, they were framed as patients rather than as immoral women. For many, this was the only socially acceptable way to explore the sensations of their own bodies. They endured the hours because the alternative was silence and suffering. Doctors knew this, and they held the authority to declare when the treatment had been successful. It is not difficult to see echoes of this power imbalance today, when people rely on specialists and must accept their word as final, even when their own experiences tell them more. The repetition of the treatment created peculiar relationships between doctor and patient. Some women returned regularly, their symptoms conveniently recurring. The doctor's office became a place where repression briefly gave way to sensation. The women might not have had the language to describe what they felt, but they knew they left with relief. Physicians, meanwhile, could assure themselves that they were only doing their duty. They noted improvements in mood, reductions in nervous agitation, and calmer behavior in their patients. In the language of medicine, these were therapeutic outcomes. In the lived reality of the women, they were something far more intimate. For the doctors, fatigue became a genuine concern. Records from the time mention hand cramps and the physical strain of long sessions. This is what ultimately drove the search for mechanical solutions. But before that point, countless hours were spent in direct, manual work. The contrast between the detached language in their notes and the physical closeness of their actions is jarring. It is a reminder of how far society was willing to bend reality in order to maintain appearances. I cannot help but find it unsettling that so many people were complicit in pretending this was anything other than what it plainly was. These sessions reveal a truth about Victorian culture. Denial does not erase desire. By refusing to name sexuality, they only redirected it into strange and contradictory forms. Doctors were burdened with tasks that belonged outside the medical sphere, and women were given treatments that were both accepted and unmentionable. Everyone agreed to the illusion because the alternative would have been to confront female sexuality openly. That confrontation was more threatening than the quiet absurdity of doctors labouring by hand for hours at a time. The image of a physician straining through lengthy treatments while carefully recording outcomes captures the contradictions of the age. It was a culture that prized control, yet produced situations where control was only an illusion. It was a society obsessed with morality, yet dependent on silent agreements that violated its own standards. The role of the doctor as both healer and enforcer of repression made the entire arrangement possible. Without them, the silence might have broken. With them, it was preserved, one session at a time. Doctors in Victorian society became unwilling agents of contradiction, using their hands to enforce a treatment that was described in cold medical terms, but experienced as something entirely different. Women accepted the procedure because it gave them relief under the safe label of medicine, but the strain placed on doctors, both physical and cultural, was beginning to reveal cracks in the system. The problem of hysteria treatments in Victorian medicine eventually became too heavy for doctors to carry by hand. As the demand for therapy grew, so did the strain on those expected to provide it. Physicians complained that their wrists and fingers ached, that hours of work left them drained, and that patient after patient demanded more of their time than they could manage. These were not isolated remarks. They appeared in medical journals and private letters, a chorus of complaints that revealed how exhausting the routine had become. The very act that society insisted was not sexual was, in truth, such a laborious duty that the medical profession began searching for a solution. That solution came in the form of an invention. The first vibratory devices were designed not for intimacy, but for efficiency. They were powered by hand cranks, by water pressure, or later by electricity, each offering a way to relieve the doctor from hours of manual effort. What had once been the responsibility of the physician's hand was now transferred to a machine. In medical advertisements, these devices were presented with complete seriousness. They were tools for managing nervous disorders, instruments for balancing female health, and nothing more. It is almost laughable that a device so obviously connected to pleasure was described as a time-saving aid for overworked doctors. The machines quickly gained popularity. They allowed practitioners to treat more patients in less time, and they gave women faster access to the relief they had come to expect. Appointments became shorter. The strain on physicians lessened, and the demand continued to grow. Women left the clinic with the same sense of calm and release. But now the process was driven by technology rather than by hand. To the outside world, nothing seemed unusual. It was simply another step in the progress of medicine, another example of Victorian innovation applied to the challenges of modern life. The secrecy surrounding the true purpose of these devices was remarkable. In polite society, nobody admitted what everyone privately understood. Medical texts spoke of nervous energy, uterine congestion, and overstimulation of the female system. Nowhere did they acknowledge that the machine was producing orgasms. The silence was deliberate, an extension of the culture that denied women any open recognition of desire. Doctors knew, patients knew, and yet both sides agreed to maintain the illusion. In many ways, this resembles modern products that are advertised with vague claims about wellness, while everyone quietly acknowledges the real reasons people buy them. The machines themselves varied in design. Some were large contraptions, bolted to the floor of clinics and powered by heavy motors. Others were small and portable, designed for home use among the wealthy. Regardless of size, their function was the same: to induce release more quickly and reliably than a doctor's hand. In doing so, they transformed the experience of treatment into something that looked even more mechanical, more detached from any human connection. Women could now be treated with greater speed, and physicians could move from one appointment to the next without complaint. For women, the introduction of vibratory devices did not change the explanation they were given. They were still told that the procedure balanced their nerves, cleared their systems, and restored their health. But the efficiency of the machines made treatment more accessible. Some women could now schedule more frequent sessions, while others began to purchase the devices for private use at home. Advertisements presented them as tools of hygiene and health, perfect for the refined household that valued discretion. The medical mask was still firmly in place, even as the truth of their use was obvious. The growth of this market is a reminder of how demand can overcome taboo. Victorian society refused to name female desire, but it allowed technology to provide for it under another name. The contradiction reveals itself in every detail: machines built for pleasure but called medical, women who sought them eagerly but described their use as treatment, doctors who relied on them daily while insisting their role was purely professional. I cannot help but think how fragile the system of denial must have been, that an entire industry could flourish in plain sight without ever admitting its true purpose. In the broader history of medicine, the invention of the vibrator is sometimes treated as a curiosity, a footnote in the story of technological progress. But in its time, it was a solution to a very real problem for physicians, and it exposed the cracks in Victorian culture. The sheer number of women seeking treatment for hysteria forced society to confront something it had long ignored. Women's bodies demanded attention, and no amount of silence could erase that fact. The machine became a symbol not only of medical progress, but also of the hidden negotiation between repression and reality. The irony is that this so-called medical device granted women access to an experience society denied them in every other context. Within the walls of the doctor's office or behind the privacy of their own doors, women encountered a kind of relief that was otherwise forbidden. The disguise of medicine made it possible. Without that disguise, the machine would never have been tolerated. The fact that it survived and thrived tells us how much society depended on preserving the illusion, while quietly meeting the needs it could not name. In the end, the invention of the vibrator was not simply about easing the burden on doctors. It was about maintaining a system of denial, a way to continue treating hysteria without ever acknowledging what hysteria truly represented. It preserved the silence around female sexuality, while simultaneously giving it a hidden outlet. That paradox defined Victorian culture at its core: a refusal to see openly what everyone already knew. Doctors, overwhelmed by the demand for hysteria treatment, turned to machines that offered speed and efficiency while pretending to be neutral medical tools. Women received the same relief under the guise of health, and society maintained its silence even as technology exposed the truth. But what began as a tool for physicians soon became something women sought eagerly, a discreet escape from the restrictions imposed on their lives. Victorian women who experienced medical treatment for hysteria often described the results in vague but telling terms. They said they felt lighter, calmer, or more refreshed. They spoke of clarity returning to their minds, of a burden lifted from their bodies. These were the words they could use safely, words that fit within the medical framework provided to them. To speak openly of pleasure was impossible, but to say they felt relief after a session was acceptable. In that gap between what could be said and what was truly felt, an unspoken dependence began to form. The pattern soon became clear to doctors. Patients returned again and again, reporting the same symptoms that justified another appointment. Some scheduled frequent visits, insisting that their nerves had worsened or that their fatigue had returned. The diagnosis of hysteria allowed this cycle to continue without challenge. Each visit was recorded as legitimate treatment, yet everyone involved understood that something more was happening. It is almost amusing to imagine how doctors pretended to be surprised each time the same patients returned, as if they did not already know why the demand was so constant. For many women, these sessions became the only socially acceptable way to experience their own bodies. The treatments gave them sensations they had never been encouraged to explore elsewhere. The release they felt was not framed as indulgence but as medicine, and that distinction protected them from judgment. They could not confess desire, but they could speak of nerves. They could not admit longing, but they could mention tension. Within the narrow space created by hysteria's diagnosis, they found a channel that allowed them to return without shame. At the same time, women were caught in a bind of secrecy. They could not openly say they longed for treatment. They had to hide their eagerness behind symptoms. This forced them to play roles, to act as though they were unwell, even when what they wanted was relief. It created a strange performance in which women described their suffering in order to secure access to something that actually gave them joy. The irony was cruel, yet it was also a survival strategy. Without the disguise of illness, they would have been condemned. The situation is not so different from modern contexts where people frame personal choices as health needs to avoid criticism. In private, some women admitted their feelings more honestly. Letters and journals from the period reveal descriptions of treatment that went beyond medical relief. Words like ecstasy or rapture slipped into the accounts, though usually hidden between lines of restraint. These glimpses show that women knew exactly what was happening, even if society refused to acknowledge it. They were aware of the difference between a tonic and what they experienced in the clinic. The problem was never their understanding, but the cultural ban on saying it aloud. Reading these fragments, I find myself struck by how carefully women had to edit their own truths just to survive within the roles imposed on them. The demand for treatment created a cycle that benefited both patients and physicians. Women gained access to sensations that society denied them, while doctors secured steady work. Clinics grew busier, and machines made it possible to treat even more patients in less time. The system fed on itself, growing as silence ensured it could continue without exposure. So long as everyone maintained the fiction that hysteria required frequent intervention, the arrangement held. What made this dependency even more striking was how deeply it contrasted with public expectations. Respectable women were supposed to embody restraint, purity, and self-denial. Yet behind closed doors, many sought out repeated experiences of physical release. The contradiction did not collapse the system because it was never openly named. Silence was the glue that kept it together. By refusing to acknowledge the truth, society allowed a practice that contradicted its own values to thrive. This addiction to treatment was not an addiction in the modern sense of a chemical substance. It was an addiction to access, to a chance to feel something otherwise forbidden. For women whose marriages were cold, whose education denied them knowledge, whose culture demanded silence, these sessions were moments of discovery. They were brief, controlled, and disguised, but they were real. They were reminders that their bodies could do more than endure duty. The continuation of these treatments shows the resilience of desire in the face of repression. Denial did not erase it. Silence did not kill it. Instead, desire adapted, finding a way to live within the rules that tried to suffocate it. The medical setting gave it cover, the diagnosis gave it permission, and the machines gave it speed. In the end, what appeared to be a treatment for hysteria was also a quiet rebellion against the suffocating codes of the age. Women in Victorian society returned again and again to medical treatments, framing their need as illness while secretly seeking the sensations that gave them relief. This cycle revealed both the power of repression and the ways women learned to survive within it. Yet the more demand grew, the more doctors had to justify their role, leading to further entanglement between morality, medicine, and control. The legitimization of female orgasm in Victorian medicine was one of the strangest contradictions of the age. In a society that denied women the right to even speak of desire, doctors were quietly providing them with regular access to experiences that belonged, by every cultural standard, to the realm of sin. Yet by cloaking these experiences in medical language, orgasm was not called pleasure, but a psychological release. It was treated as if the body had been holding on to something dangerous, and that a physician's intervention restored balance. This framework gave women a doorway into sensations they were forbidden to acknowledge, and it allowed men of science to deny any link to sexuality. The shift depended entirely on language. Words like nervous relief or discharge of fluids replaced any reference to desire. The act was transformed from something scandalous into something necessary. A woman leaving the doctor's office was not seen as indulging in forbidden behavior, but as recovering her health. This reframing was powerful because it allowed the entire culture to maintain its denial. everyone could continue pretending that women were pure, while at the same time enabling them to access something entirely human. It is almost funny how quickly morality can bend when given the right vocabulary to hide behind. Women themselves embraced this explanation because it gave them safety. To admit that they had felt pleasure would have been to risk shame and exclusion. To say instead that they had undergone a treatment was to stay within the rules. This gave them access without condemnation, even if it required them to hide what they really knew. Many of them likely understood the reality but chose the mask because it protected them. Within that mask, they could return again and again, each time assured that what they were doing was not indulgence but healing. For the doctors, this system provided a professional shield. They could maintain their status as respectable men of science while performing treatments that, stripped of medical language, would have been judged immoral. The notes they kept, the lectures they gave, and the advertisements they supported all used the same neutral terms. The repetition of these terms created a kind of truth by constant assertion. When a word is used enough times, it begins to erase the word it replaced. In this case, therapy erased pleasure, at least in public. The scale of this legitimization was significant. Thousands of women across Europe and North America were treated in this way, and records from hospitals showed just how routine it became. In many cities, hysteria was one of the most commonly diagnosed conditions for women. It became a catch-all explanation for nervousness, fatigue, headaches, or simple restlessness. By expanding the boundaries of the illness, doctors increased the number of women eligible for treatment. This created a cycle where both diagnosis and therapy reinforced each other. When you look at it closely, it is not so different from modern industries that invent new categories of illness just to market new solutions. For women, this legitimization opened a small but crucial door. They were given access to their own bodies in a way that was otherwise forbidden. No education prepared them for it. No conversation with family would have allowed it. But within the doctor's office, they could experience release without fear of condemnation, even if they did not name it for what it was. They felt it. That feeling mattered, and it changed how they understood themselves. Some recorded their experiences in private diaries, careful to keep the language vague, yet revealing enough to show they knew what was happening. This normalization also influenced how families viewed treatment. Husbands and fathers could approve of visits to the doctor without shame, because it was considered medical care. They did not have to admit that their wives or daughters were experiencing pleasure. They could continue to think of themselves as guardians of morality while quietly allowing medicine to handle what society would not face. This arrangement maintained the illusion of purity within the household. It protected reputations, and it allowed women to continue visiting doctors without suspicion. When I reflect on this, I find it astonishing how effectively denial can function when everyone benefits from pretending. The legitimacy of orgasm as therapy also shows how powerfully society can reshape reality. What should have been recognized as natural was instead recast as pathological. By diagnosing desire as hysteria, doctors created the excuse for treatment. By calling orgasm relief rather than pleasure, they made it acceptable. This twisting of language reveals the depth of control in Victorian culture. Women were not free to claim ownership of their experiences. They had to accept them under the terms dictated by others. Yet even within this control, there was a form of quiet resistance. Each treatment session, however disguised, gave women a glimpse of themselves outside the boundaries imposed on them. They may not have been able to name it, but they could feel it. That feeling was undeniable, and once known, it could not be forgotten. Over time, this subtle access to their own bodies chipped away at the cultural silence. It did not break it entirely, but it created cracks that would later widen into greater challenges to Victorian morality. In truth, the medical profession had legitimized female pleasure without admitting it. They had turned it into something safe for society, something respectable, something controlled. But in doing so, they had also normalized the act itself, making it part of ordinary life for countless women. The irony is that in trying to suppress sexuality, they created one of the few socially sanctioned outlets for it. They gave women the very thing society had worked so hard to deny. The legitimization of orgasm in medicine was both a mask and a key. It hid female desire under a new name, but it also unlocked access that had long been sealed off. In that sense, it was one of the most remarkable contradictions of the Victorian age, a society obsessed with purity and denial, yet quietly building a medical system that delivered what it refused to recognize. Victorian medicine reframed orgasm as therapy, stripping away its connection to pleasure while presenting it as a cure for hysteria. This allowed women to reach experiences otherwise denied to them, and it preserved society's illusion of purity. But the growing demand for treatment did not stop there, and soon the diagnosis of hysteria itself became a trend that spread rapidly across the culture. The diagnosis of hysteria in Victorian society expanded at a pace that few other conditions could match. What began as a vague explanation for nervousness or emotional unrest soon became a label applied to nearly every imaginable symptom in women. If a woman complained of fatigue, it could be hysteria. If she suffered from headaches, sleeplessness, or even irritability, the same label was applied. The boundaries of the illness grew wider and wider, until it seemed almost every woman could be said to suffer from it at some point in her life. This expansion was not accidental. It reflected both the medical profession's eagerness to provide treatment and society's need to keep female behavior under control. The rise of hysteria as a diagnosis created a strange paradox. On the one hand, it gave women access to doctors and treatments that provided real relief. On the other hand, it turned ordinary experiences into medicalized conditions, reinforcing the idea that women were inherently unstable. Doctors had an incentive to continue this pattern. The more symptoms that counted as hysteria, the more patients they had. Families, too, found the diagnosis convenient. It explained away behaviors or complaints that might otherwise challenge the authority of husbands or fathers. By calling these problems hysteria, they kept everything neatly within the framework of medicine rather than morality. Hospitals and clinics soon began to adapt to the growing demand. Special wards were created to deal specifically with female nervous disorders. These wards became filled with women from different social backgrounds, all united by the same vague diagnosis. Some patients stayed for days, others for weeks, and still others returned regularly as outpatients. The sheer volume of cases made hysteria one of the defining conditions of 19th century medicine. It is almost comical to realize that something as ordinary as feeling tired after household work could be transformed into a medical crisis demanding treatment. The culture that surrounded hysteria encouraged its growth. Newspapers reported on it with an air of seriousness, presenting it as one of the most pressing medical issues of the age. Books and lectures for the middle classes spoke about the dangers of female nerves, warning that unchecked hysteria could lead to madness or decline. Mothers worried that their daughters might show symptoms, and husbands believed their wives' complaints fit the pattern. The more people talked about hysteria, the more it seemed to appear everywhere. This was not just a medical phenomenon but a social trend, one that reinforced the belief that women were fragile and in need of constant supervision. The range of symptoms included under the diagnosis grew so broad that almost anything could qualify. A woman who lost her appetite, a woman who felt faint in church, a woman who cried too much, even a woman who laughed too loudly, could all be said to have hysteria. This flexibility made the diagnosis nearly impossible to dispute. Doctors did not need to prove anything specific. They only had to match a symptom with the label. Patients had little room to question the process, and families often preferred not to. It kept everything within a respectable framework, even if it meant reducing women's lives to endless lists of vague complaints. Looking at this from today's perspective, it is not unlike how modern culture sometimes uses overgeneralized mental health labels in ways that blur real suffering with everyday stress. For many women, hysteria became both a burden and an opportunity. It was a burden because it cast them as weak, unstable, and in need of constant medical attention, it undermined their credibility, making it easier for others to dismiss their voices. But it was also an opportunity, because within the treatment they received lay the possibility of bodily release. They may have accepted the humiliation of the label in exchange for the relief it brought. In this sense, hysteria functioned as a kind of double-edged sword, cutting down women's autonomy while giving them access to sensations they could not otherwise explore. Doctors, for their part, continued to expand their role. As the diagnosis spread, they justified the creation of entire specialties around female nervous disorders. Some even built reputations and careers on treating hysteria, publishing detailed accounts of their methods and results. Clinics competed to attract female patients, offering the latest devices and techniques. The medical system grew increasingly invested in sustaining the diagnosis, for without it, a major source of work and income would disappear. I cannot help but find it unsettling that women's suffering was both a justification for medical authority and a profitable industry at the same time. The spread of hysteria also reflected broader anxieties about women's place in society. The 19th century was marked by debates over education, work, and political rights for women. Those who opposed greater freedom often pointed to hysteria as evidence that women were too fragile for such responsibilities. By labeling ordinary behaviors as medical conditions, the culture reinforced the idea that women could not handle independence. This made the diagnosis not just a medical tool but a social weapon, used to justify restrictions on women's roles. The consequences of this expansion were profound. Countless women found themselves living under the shadow of hysteria, their every symptom interpreted through its lens. Families learned to see illness where there may have been none. Doctors became gatekeepers of both health and morality, and women themselves were caught in a cycle of treatment and silence, unable to name their own experiences outside the language imposed on them. The more common the diagnosis became, the harder it was to escape its reach. In the end, the rapid growth of hysteria as a diagnosis tells us less about the reality of women's health than it does about Victorian society's need to control and contain female lives. The label became a convenient solution to countless problems, medicalizing them in a way that preserved appearances and reinforced authority. Yet within this rigid system, women still found ways to navigate their own needs, even if only within the narrow space allowed to them. The diagnosis of hysteria spread at a remarkable pace, turning ordinary symptoms into medical conditions and filling hospitals with women labelled as unstable. This expansion reinforced cultural control but also created new opportunities for treatment. Yet the sheer popularity of the diagnosis raised troubling questions about how far society would go to disguise its own contradictions. Records from the Victorian era reveal that even convents, places imagined to be untouched by the outside world, were not immune to the spread of hysterical treatments. Within the walls of monasteries and convents, women who had sworn vows of purity and obedience found themselves facing the same diagnoses as women in ordinary households. The language used to describe their conditions was careful and subdued, often referring to nervous imbalance, fatigue, or spiritual weakness. Yet behind those words lay the same reality. Physicians were being called in to provide the treatment that had become a cornerstone of Victorian medicine. The very women who embodied the ideals of chastity and discipline were now placed in situations where their bodies were handled under the guise of a cure. The medical notes preserved from some convents show a remarkable consistency with those from city hospitals. The doctors described the process in clinical terms, never hinting at the contradiction between their actions and the vows of their patients. They wrote of muscle relaxation, of reduced agitation, of restored calm. What they did not write was the obvious truth, that the same therapy given to married women and widows was now being extended to nuns. It is almost absurd to imagine how a society that prized spiritual purity tolerated treatments that so clearly contradicted the very concept of untouched devotion. For the women themselves, the experience must have been deeply confusing. Their lives were organized around discipline, silence, and denial of the flesh. They were told that their value lay in abstinence, in controlling every desire. Yet when hysteria was suspected, they were sent to doctors who used touch as medicine. This clash between religious teaching and medical practice was not spoken of, but it could not have been invisible to the women who lived it. To undergo such treatment was to discover that even in a life devoted to God, the body could not be fully erased. The secrecy of these treatments was carefully guarded. Sessions often took place in small infirmary rooms or behind locked doors, scheduled discreetly during hours when other sisters were occupied in prayer. Doctors were ushered in quietly, their presence explained in vague terms. To the outside world, nothing unusual was happening inside the convent. The reputation of the institution depended on maintaining this illusion. For the clergy who oversaw these places, the preservation of appearances was more important than confronting the contradiction. The silence around female desire extended even into spaces where desire was supposed to have no place at all. In some convent records, the justification for these treatments was framed as protecting the women's ability to serve. A nun who was restless, who wept excessively, or who could not sleep was seen as unfit to carry out her duties. The therapy was thus explained as restoring her to spiritual balance. This language made the treatment seem necessary, even holy in its outcome. Yet the methods remained unchanged from those used elsewhere. It was the same process, the same result, cloaked in different words to make it acceptable in a religious setting. In today's terms, this is not unlike institutions bending rules quietly while insisting publicly that they uphold the higher standards. The presence of male doctors in convents is itself revealing, at a time when men and women were often kept strictly apart in matters of modesty. Here they were allowed intimate access to women who had vowed never to be touched. The authority of medicine overruled the authority of religion, at least in practice. This shift reflects the growing power of the medical profession in Victorian society. Priests and nuns might control the soul, but doctors were granted control over the body, even in sacred spaces. The coexistence of these authorities created tension that was never spoken but always present. For the nuns, the contradiction could only be endured in silence. To speak of the details of treatment would have undermined both their personal vows and the reputation of their community. They had to accept what was given to them as medical necessity, even if it conflicted with everything they had been taught about purity. This silence reveals how thoroughly Victorian culture controlled female bodies. Even those who withdrew from the world to avoid such entanglements could not escape them. The irony of the situation is striking. Convents were often upheld as symbols of moral discipline, presented as examples of how women could rise above worldly desires. Yet within their walls, treatments that revolved around the most physical of sensations were being administered. This gap between image and reality captures the heart of the Victorian contradiction. The same society that condemned women for acknowledging sexuality allowed their most sacred representatives to undergo intimate procedures, so long as they were labelled as cures. I find it deeply unsettling to think about how many women endured this in silence, caught between vows they could not break and treatments they could not refuse. The fact that doctors recorded these cases at all shows how normalised the practice had become. They did not see them as exceptional or scandalous. They were simply more patients in need of attention. That ordinariness reveals the extent to which the diagnosis of hysteria had spread. Touching every corner of society, no woman, regardless of status, was beyond its reach. The spread of the treatment into convents demonstrates that even the strictest barriers of morality could not hold back the cultural force of medicalized female desire. This chapter of history reminds us that repression does not eliminate human need. By refusing to acknowledge female sexuality openly, Victorian society only redirected it into hidden places. Convents became one of those places, paradoxically both shielded and exposed. The silence that surrounded these treatments was not accidental. It was a deliberate strategy to maintain reputations, to preserve illusions, and to avoid the scandal that open acknowledgement would have caused. Yet behind that silence, the truth remained. Women's bodies demanded recognition. no matter where they lived or what vows they had taken. In the end, the treatments carried out in convents stand as one of the most striking examples of Victorian denial. They show that even the most sacred institutions were not free from the contradictions of the age. They also show how powerful the medical profession had become, capable of crossing boundaries that once seemed impenetrable. By legitimizing orgasm as therapy, doctors gained entry into spaces that religion claimed as its own, and in doing so, they exposed the limits of a culture that tried desperately to separate purity from desire. The spread of hysterical treatments into convents revealed the deep contradictions of Victorian morality, where even women who had sworn vows of purity found themselves subject to the same therapies as everyone else. Silence preserved reputations, but it also masked the growing authority of medicine over women's lives. The influence of this system did not end at convent walls, and its impact would soon shape marriages as well, redefining how intimacy and morality were negotiated in households across the era. Victorian medicine not only shaped the lives of women in clinics and convents, it also crept into the private world of marriage, redefining what stability and morality meant inside the home. Doctors frequently advised husbands to moderate their relations with their wives, warning that too much physical intimacy could weaken a woman's body or disturb her delicate balance. These warnings were framed as medical wisdom, but they had little to do with women's actual health. Instead, they reinforced the cultural idea that women should remain restrained, passive, and pure. What is striking is that while husbands were told to abstain for the sake of their wives' well-being, the same wives were quietly being treated by doctors in ways that openly contradicted this advice. The justification for these treatments rested on a peculiar logic. Doctors claimed that orgasm in the medical setting calmed women, reduced nervous agitation, and restored order to their emotions. It was presented as therapy, not indulgence. The same act that was discouraged in the marital bedroom was encouraged in the physician's office, but only because it was cloaked in the language of cure. It is almost laughable to see how a society could condemn intimacy between spouses while simultaneously promoting the same experience as medicine when provided by a stranger. This contradiction reveals the extent to which control over female sexuality had shifted from the household to the medical profession. Husbands were told not to stimulate desire, but doctors claimed the authority to manage it under clinical terms. Wives, caught in the middle, were expected to comply with both sets of rules. They were asked to remain chaste in marriage, yet they were ushered into treatments that produced release. This strange division of roles created a quiet but powerful reshaping of intimacy itself. The physician became an arbiter of balance, while the husband remained a guardian of appearances. For women, the impact was complex. On one level, they gained access to experiences of their own bodies that marriage often denied them. On another level, they were reminded that this access could never belong to them openly. It was only allowed under the supervision of a doctor, framed as necessary for mental stability. Their own desires were never acknowledged as valid. Instead, they were told that their calmer mood, their improved obedience, and their restored energy proved the treatment's value. Pleasure was never named, but its effects were quietly measured in how a woman behaved afterward. In modern terms, it feels similar to workplaces that praise productivity without admitting the exhaustion that produces it. The medical framing of orgasm as a tool for moral stability had consequences for marriage itself. Husbands were reassured that their wives would be more agreeable after treatment. Doctors even suggested that such therapies could prevent marital discord, making women calmer and more willing to perform their duties at home. This cast orgasm not as a private matter of intimacy, but as a form of social control. It was used to preserve the structure of Victorian families, to maintain appearance of order and obedience. A woman's experience was reduced to a prescription for her role as wife. Records from the period show that many men accepted this arrangement without question. They saw doctors as allies in maintaining domestic peace. If a wife seemed restless or discontent, she was sent for treatment. If she complained of nerves or headaches, she was given a diagnosis of hysteria and a course of therapy. By outsourcing responsibility for their wives' well-being, husbands could maintain the illusion that they were both caring and authoritative. The contradiction, that they avoided intimacy at home while it flourished in the clinic, was never openly discussed. I cannot help but find it disturbing how easily an intimate aspect of human life was turned into a clinical instrument of obedience. Women who lived under this system carried the burden of silence. They were expected to return from treatment calmer, quieter, and more compliant. They could not speak of what had actually happened, only of the improvement in their symptoms. This silence preserved the illusion that the marriage remained morally pure while still allowing women access to release. Yet the silence also erased their voices. They were not participants in shaping the terms of their own relationships. They were patients, treated into obedience, their needs disguised as medical necessity. The role of the doctor in marriage was more than just therapeutic. It reinforced the broader cultural narrative that women could not manage themselves. They needed external authority, whether from husbands, clergy, or physicians. In this sense, orgasm was not just medicalized but domesticated, repurposed as a tool of governance. It became a way of regulating women's behavior rather than recognizing their autonomy. The very act that should have represented mutual intimacy was stripped of its meaning and used as a means of control. This intersection of medicine and marriage illustrates the depth of Victorian denial. By refusing to name female desire, society forced it into channels that transformed it into something else entirely. Doctors became custodians of women's sexuality, while husbands maintained their roles as guardians of morality. The result was a household where intimacy was fragmented, divided between duty and therapy, between silence and hidden sensation. The consequences of this arrangement reached far beyond individual marriages. It shaped how entire communities thought about women, reinforcing the view that they were naturally unstable and needed constant supervision. It gave medical professionals greater authority, not only in clinics but in homes, where their advice dictated how couples managed their private lives, and it left women in a position where their bodies were treated as instruments for maintaining order rather than as sources of independent agency. In Victorian households, orgasm was reframed as a tool for restoring obedience, transforming an intimate act into a form of medical and moral control. Husbands were told to abstain, while doctors administered treatment that produced the very experiences marriage denied. This contradiction kept families appearing stable, but it also revealed the strange imbalance at the heart of Victorian ideas about love and discipline. Victorian medicine often favoured physical treatment over chemical remedies, especially when it came to the vague but widespread diagnosis of hysteria. Instead of prescribing sedatives or sleeping draughts, many doctors recommended what they termed pelvic massage. The practice was explained as a way to soothe the overstimulated uterus, a phrase that appeared in countless medical notes of the time. By framing the treatment in such terms, physicians avoided prescribing opiates or tonics, while providing a form of relief that seemed both safe and effective. In reality, the method replaced chemical sedation with a physical process that society continued to deny for what it truly was. The reasoning behind this substitution was built on cultural fears as much as on medical theory. Sedatives carried risks, and many physicians were aware that repeated use could lead to dependence. Families also worried about the effects of heavy medicines on women's already fragile constitutions. Pelvic massage, by contrast, was presented as a natural method, restoring balance through the release of nervous energy. It was said to calm the body without introducing dangerous substances. To patients, this explanation sounded rational. To doctors, it provided a way to continue the cycle of treatment without the risks that came with drugs. It is almost comical that what was essentially a manual act of inducing orgasm was considered safer and more respectable than a spoonful of medicine. The treatment quickly became a substitute for sedatives in many cases. Women who suffered from insomnia, agitation, or persistent anxiety were not given powders or syrups. Instead, they were scheduled for therapy sessions. In these sessions, their symptoms were reframed as signs of nervous imbalance. not simply sleeplessness or stress. Relief came in the form of release, after which the patient reported calm and often slept better. The result reinforced the belief that this approach was superior to medication. Doctors recorded these cases in detached language, as though they were describing the effects of any other clinical intervention. They noted the time it took for patients to relax, the changes in mood, and the restoration of sleep. What they did not mention was the obvious truth of what was happening. By calling it uterine soothing or nervous discharge, they kept the treatment within the boundaries of science rather than intimacy. The silence around pleasure remained intact, even as women experienced it repeatedly in the course of their supposed therapy. In a way, this mirrors modern practices where euphemistic terms are used to disguise uncomfortable realities, making them easier for institutions to defend. For women, the replacement of sedatives with therapy had real effects on their lives. Instead of being dulled by strong medicine, they were given a treatment that left them refreshed, calmer, and more alert. They often described the outcome as feeling lighter, clearer, or more at peace. The relief was immediate and noticeable, and it encouraged them to return whenever symptoms arose again. The cycle of treatment became both accessible and dependable, something that tonics and sedatives often failed to provide. I find it revealing how women quickly learned to value this form of therapy, even if they could not name it openly. This substitution also reinforced the authority of doctors. By promoting their treatments as safer alternatives to drugs, they positioned themselves as guardians of both health and morality. They could claim that they were protecting women from the dangers of medicine while offering a solution that produced immediate results. The contradiction was that this solution required physical contact of a kind that society normally forbade. Yet the authority of medicine was strong enough to override those concerns. Families trusted doctors, and women complied with the treatments, all under the belief that it was the most respectable path available. Hospitals and clinics began to formalize this approach, making therapy sessions a common alternative to prescriptions. Wealthier families also arranged for private sessions at home, preferring the discretion of medical visits to the risks of chemical sedatives. In both cases, the result was the same orgasm was delivered as treatment, justified as therapy, and accepted as part of the medical landscape. The more this pattern continued, the more normalized it became. Soon, the idea of treating nerves or insomnia with pelvic massage was no longer surprising but expected. This shift away from sedatives also highlights the Victorian tendency to disguise desire as disorder. By refusing to acknowledge sexuality directly, society channeled it into medical practice. Doctors did not cure hysteria with drugs because drugs were too blunt and carried too much risk. Instead, they cured it with release, repackaged as a medical act. The line between treatment and indulgence blurred further with each passing year, and yet the silence held. So long as no one spoke openly, the illusion of propriety was preserved. The substitution of orgasm for sedatives demonstrates the adaptability of Victorian medicine. It shows how physicians could manipulate definitions to create acceptable practices, and how society could embrace contradictions so long as they were cloaked in medical authority. It also shows how women navigated within these contradictions, learning to seek relief where they could, even if they had to pretend it was something else. In the end, the replacement of sleeping powders with pelvic massage did not just change medical practice. It revealed the priorities of Victorian culture, preserving appearances, avoiding scandal, and maintaining control over women's bodies. Medicine provided the cover, women found the relief, and society pretended that nothing unusual was happening. Victorian doctors often chose therapy over sedatives, offering women release under the name of medical necessity instead of dulling them with drugs. This method calmed nerves, improved sleep, and preserved the illusion of propriety. Yet by relying on it so heavily, society only deepened its silence around female sexuality, leaving women caught between denial and discovery. Among the wealthy families of Victorian society, the treatment of hysteria moved from the clinic into the privacy of the home. Those who could afford it no longer had to schedule visits with doctors or endure the long waits in crowded offices. Instead, they purchased or rented vibratory devices, often powered by steam or early mechanical systems, and had them installed in discreet rooms of their own houses. These rooms were designed with care, furnished with the same elegance that marked the rest of the household, yet hidden enough to ensure that no guest would stumble upon them. The medical facade was preserved, but now it was wrapped in the luxury and secrecy of aristocratic life. The machines themselves were large and often complicated. Some required entire chambers to house their boilers and motors. Servants were tasked with maintaining them, though they were rarely told the full purpose. Officially, the devices were described as instruments of health, a modern marvel of medical technology that reflected the family's refinement. They were spoken of as one might speak of a bath or a tonic, a tool for restoring balance and ensuring vitality. It is almost laughable to imagine such contraptions being paraded as health equipment, while everyone in the household surely knew their real function. For the women who used them, these machines offered independence that clinic visits could not provide.